Welcome back, everyone.
Hi there.
Welcome back, Neil. So, Neil, can you tell us more about the use of timelines, please,
Yes,
before we start?
absolutely. But before I do, if it's okay, Hedy, what I'd like to do is just run a very quick poll. So I'd be really interested to find out who we have with us today, and in particular, find out a little bit about your teaching experience. So it's just a one question poll for you, which probes how much teaching experience you have. That'll help me just to pitch this presentation so it's as useful as possible for you. So I'm going to launch the poll now. Notice in the first option, pre-service teacher. By this I mean someone who, for example, is not yet qualified as a teacher, but is currently doing or thinking of doing in the future some kind of training course to become a teacher of English as a foreign language. Okay, so yeah, the results are coming in. And interestingly, we have a considerable body of experience here. 76% of you have more than 2 years experience. So I feel both very honoured, but also slightly, what's the word? Responsibility to make sure that I pitch this right for you. To use that English idiom, I don't want to tell grandmother how to suck eggs. A couple of you, we've got 15% who are newly qualified, and then just a small minority, but I hope today has been clear for you in terms of you being 7% pre-service trainers. A couple of people who haven't voted, but mindful that we want to talk about timelines. I'm going to end the polling now and share my screen with you, and then let's have a look at timelines. So as I share my screen with you now, what you'll be able to see, perhaps I should do an information checking question here, and you can put your answers into chat. Can you confirm with a yes or no answer? I can see on screen a screen with timelines and the number 5 on it. What answer should you write in the chat box? Yes or no? Correct. So if you can just go to chat and just to confirm for me that you can in fact see that, that would be really helpful. Okay, so we've got chat coming in. Yep, you can see it. Fantastic. So I've been working here. I will have been working here for 5 years by the end of June. And, you know, we've got the CCQs down here at the bottom with the concept very clearly explained. And this is coming from Workman's book, Concept, Questions and Timelines. The bad news is that it is out of print. I'm certainly not in favour of encouraging people to download things breaking copyright. But I am aware that people may well go looking for it, and if you were to do so, then using the author's name and the title might be a way of looking for it. Okay, so let me show you the timeline that Workman produced for this particular verb form. And here it is on screen now. And I just wanted to talk through with you, particularly for those of you who are less familiar, maybe you're pre-service or newly qualified, but actually how do you write a timeline? So I think one of the problems is that very often we show people timelines and somehow magically expect you to be able to do it immediately. So across the bottom here, we have a horizontal line. And that basically takes us on a time journey. Imagine we're Time Lords here. We start on the left in the past. We have that intersected with a vertical line, which helpfully has the word now above it. And then going forward, we have the future. Now, in terms of this particular piece of grammar, you'll notice now is written on the timeline. There is no reason why you can't, when you first start using these, write past here, and then with your arrow going forward, put future in there. We talked about anchoring in the chat box. We'll talk a little bit more about anchoring in a few moments. But what we're trying to do here is produce habits or routines that students become familiar with, so that after a couple of timelines over a couple of weeks, the students themselves won't need you to write past, now, future, because it will be familiar to them. And this is my next point in terms of using timelines. Yes, there are conventions for writing them, but it doesn't really matter what you do as long as it is clear to your students and it is standardized. Joe's made a point in the chat box about getting students to draw their own timelines. Fantastic. I think this presupposes that the students are sufficiently familiar initially from you of, what you expect the timeline to look like. You're going to have to guide them in this, but yes, getting them to explore it graphically is a really strong way of checking their understanding. They can write it in their books. If you've got a face-to-face course, get the students to come up to the front and draw it. Or if you're in a remote teaching environment, teaching online, if you use something like Jamboard, put the students into groups, and then different groups can be working on their timeline. You can see all of them and then compare them. Now, Workman provides some suggestions of conventions. So in terms of the conventions here, I just wanted to talk you through his recommendations, if you like. This is not fixed in stone. Therefore, if you do things slightly differently, if you have a wiggly line or a dotted line, it doesn't matter as long as your students are familiar with how you use those conventions. So we've seen already the time points, past, now, future. If we now look here, he's suggesting that you use a cross in order to indicate a single completed action. So if you're talking about narrative tenses, where you've got a series of completed actions in the past, you might have a series of crosses for your past simple. So you might be saying, I stood at the corner of the road, I looked ahead, and I saw my friend Jane. I waved at her. Series of those crosses for those completed single actions. Notice how this can be an action in the past for the past simple, or if you're talking about a specific future point. The example here is, I will be 30 on Friday. You can have a single point also indicating a one-off future fact. Workman then suggests, and you can see here a squiggly line for a continuous action. Sorry, so if I go back to my example of seeing your friend Jane and waving at her, I stood at the corner of the road, I saw my friend Jane, I waved at her, I crossed the road. When I was crossing the road, and then that past continuous is graphically indicated as being different from the single actions, are crosses, with a wiggly line or wavy line. Further possibilities here, we've got an arrow and a straight line. This indicates an activity. Well, let's look at it. It started in the past and it's carrying on till now. Those of us familiar will automatically identify we're in the realms of the perfectives. And here, the present perfect. I've lived here for 4 years. Now, you might think, well, the likelihood is that if I've lived here for 4 years, I will continue to live here tomorrow and next month. So we can also identify the future elements of the present perfect by having a extended dotted line, and the dotted line indicates maybe. I think particularly if we take the present perfect continuous, I have been studying Italian for 30 years. CCQ, when did it start? 30 years ago. Is it happening today? Yes. Is it likely to happen tomorrow and next month? Yes. So, you know, looking at this timeline and using it as a way of contrasting two tenses, quite usefully, you could ask the students to complete the timeline with their dotted line to indicate the likelihood of the continuation into the future. The last point, I don't actually use this convention, Workman recommends it, is he's talking about a curved line with a question marks to show an action that doesn't have a specific point in time. So his example here is, I've found someone's keys. It's not a wavy line because it happened only once. It's not a continued action of finding it time and time again. So here he has the wavy line to say it's sometime in the past. It has present relevance because I've got the keys in my pocket now and I want to give them back to the owner. But the question marks indicates we don't know exactly when it happened. And I think the point here is that you are free to use your own system for different ways of showing time, question marks, wiggly lines, straight lines, dotted lines. And, you know, how you do it is up to an extent up to you, as long as your students know what your conventions are. I'm just going to come into chat and see if there's any extra points here. Joe's making the point about being a teacher trainer, and that I tend to watch a lot of things so that I can then share them with your teachers. Absolutely, Joe. I think one of the joys of working online, albeit triggered by a very difficult set of circumstances, the pandemic, is that there are so many resources out there now which we can share with people. And I think one of the great joys of working with gallery teachers is that they've created this database of fantastic sessions with some great trainers from all over the world, which people can drop in and out of. Marta Cesare, working with Italian students, and you know, the fact that it's very visual, yes. I'm not sure that the old-fashioned thing about talking about learner styles is very helpful. I think it's now discredited. But you know, the point here is providing our students with a rich alternative way of thinking about things. And that false correspondence, which I alluded to in terms of the form of the past simple in English, and then the form of the passato prossimo in Italian, ho visto, I saw, really does help students to identify, well, what is the meaning of this word I saw, and how does it relate to the form and the meaning of the equivalent in Italian? And that Maria Giuseppa, thank you. Yes, I agree with you as well. We are really lucky to have this wealth of materials available to us. I did promise that Burku was asking, and I hope I've got the pronunciation of your name correct there, Burku, that you wanted to see the reading list. So I'll leave it on screen for a few moments. If you've got a camera, just take a quick snap of it. But can I remind you that this workshop will be available after 7 days, and that you'll be able to watch all of it at a time that's convenient for you. Okay, Burku, yep. You've seen it now. That's fantastic. Great. So what I'm going to do is come out of share so that we can now kind of come back to any questions that you'd like to ask. Pop them into chat. That seems to be where most of the questions are coming. I think there's some questions. Hedy wanted to talk about anchoring. So yeah, over to all of you, because this is not about me just talking at you. This is about us having a dialogue online.
Exactly. Until anybody asks their questions, we can, I don't know, just get started with ICQs and the importance of them.
Yes.
Information checking questions. So we could start with the discussion of why ICQs are important at all, and whether it's a good idea to use it with higher level students or students who we've had for a while with us already, who already know us.
Yes. I alluded to this in the actual recording, and I think, you know, Murphy's law: if something can go wrong, it will. I think that's true of ICQs as well. It's that wonderful moment where you've got a class, they're high level. I mean, I remember this happening to me with a group of post-proficiency Swedish teachers of English. And it was a teacher refresher program 15 or so years ago. And I remember when I did my diploma, someone saying that Hancock's pronunciation game's a fantastic resource, but just be careful because it is so complicated in terms of the instructions. So, of course, I was second week with these teachers, and I didn't check the instructions, and I thought they'd understood it. And I probably wasted 20 minutes of their lives because it was complete chaos. Now, the corrective to this, and I think, Gabby, you referred to this, was the point about, you know, the students rolling their eyes. Oh, another ICQ, here we go. And to be honest, when I say I don't care, I don't mean to be dismissive of it. But what I mean is I'd much rather make a fool of myself and get the nickname of Mr. Information Checking Question. Sorry, start again. Instruction Checking Question. And, you know, students make gentle fun of me and then have a clear idea of what's happening, than not to do it and then they just don't understand. And I think that's maybe even more important online than it is face-to-face. Because if you're working with university students, they may not all have their cameras on, so we can't even gauge their understanding by seeing them. Just looking at some of the comments that are coming in. Heidi, as a teacher yourself, how do you feel about this? And, you know, other people in watching this, please put in your comments. So ICQ all the time, even with high-level learners, and embrace the fact they may make fun of you. How does everyone else feel about this?
It has happened to me as well, and however, I find it very important to use ICQs in class, especially as you have mentioned, when you have online lessons, when you teach online, but also when you have a group of students, because those who roll their eyes are the first ones who will end up doing something completely different from what they are supposed to do.
Yeah.
And it just saves so much time, because then you will, you know, need to go to them one by one explaining what to do, and it's not the way. Yeah. So I use ICQs all the time, and it also checks my instructions as well, because if the students can answer my questions that I ask through ICQs, it means that I express myself the way I wanted.
Yes.
So.
And I think there was a point in chat from Gabby talking about observing countless numbers of teachers in her work as a teacher trainer. And I've seen teachers with a lot of experience who become complacent. I think I was one of those teachers, and it was only when I became a CELTA trainer that I suddenly realized, heck, I've got to really be good at this. And, you know, it's a case of not just do as I say, but do as I do. And that was a really important moment in my development when I just thought, actually, I'm going to do these ICQs to death with whomever I'm teaching because, well, the reasons you've just explained. Michael has made the point here. It's really helpful to hear veteran teachers, thank you, Michael, say how important both ICQs and CCQs are. Definitely. There is no such thing as the experienced teacher who grows out of ICQs and CCQs, we may be more confident in thinking them up on the spot, but that comes with its dangers. But I think if we forget them, then we're doing our students a disservice, because let's face it, we may have 20, 30 years veterans experience, but for that new group that you're teaching for the first time, they're seeing you on day one.
And also, like, asking information, checking questions goes together with giving instructions.
Yeah.
And so this kind of keeps us focused as well. And what I mean by this is that often we go to the place where we give too many instructions, too many steps away, instead of going, step by step, exactly what you actually demonstrated by comparing bad and good instructions. And so this asking ICQs can, just help us as well and remind us that, okay, just one step at a time.
And I think the reflective teacher, I mean, Gabby is saying, we're all guilty of being complacent. The reflective teacher who doesn't do it very well one day and the class becomes a bit of a kind of a moment of disaster. I mean, I think let's be nice to ourselves and just admit we're not going to get it right every time. None of us are. But the time when it goes wrong, or we didn't do it clearly, or we did too many, or we didn't do any at all, is that moment in time where we just need to step back as reflective practitioners and think, okay, I do need to shape up on this. And this is why I think peer review is so useful. If you think that you're at risk of becoming a bit complacent with your ICQs and CCQs, next time you have a peer review, or peer observation, sorry, ask one of your colleagues, just listen out for my ICQs and CCQs. How did they work? That could be very telling. And right now, when we perhaps don't have colleagues who can pop into our classrooms, with the students' permission, of course, record the session, watch it back, be yourself observer, and think, was there a CCQ there? Was that an ICQ? Was that clear? Very useful tool, I think.
Yes, and I'm wondering how much we should prepare for that. We have a lot of experienced teachers attending today, for instance, with more than 2 years of experience already. So I've learned that we cannot take anything for granted, even though sometimes we may do. But so how much should we prepare for this? Shall we write them down in advance, or just go with the flow?
I don't think we've got a chance to do a poll on the fly, but if we ask people to reply in chat, and the question is this, do you prepare CCQs before the lesson or do you do them spontaneously? So if in chat you can write prepared in advance or spontaneously. So let's just do an ICQ now, shall we? Where do you write your answers? In chat. What answers are available? Prepared in advance or spontaneously? What's the question? Do I prepare my ICQs and CCQs in advance or spontaneously in class? And let's see what everyone has to say. So we've had a couple of answers in already in chat. Okay, so we've got a split. Some people doing it in advance, some people not always pre-prepared. Gabby makes the interesting point that she thinks about and considers the instructions, but as long as they're delivered correctly, the ICQs should almost come naturally. And I think that's pretty much something that's true of most experienced teachers. Hedy, what do you do?
I prepare. I do not take things for granted. So I'm a non-native speaker. This is one of the reasons, and I'm just built like that anyway. So it's I prefer to prepare. I try and not to be a control freak in a sense, but I prepare states actually similarly to Gabi. So I definitely have the steps that we are going to do in class, and the instructions as well. I form it. I do not necessarily write them down, to be honest, but I make sure that I just that I have them ready in my mind. So I have something written down on a piece of paper, definitely. So a little bit of plan of what to do. Whether I have one-to-one lesson to teach, a group lesson, online, face-to-face, doesn't matter. I have a plan to guide me.
And I think that's a really interesting and valuable point, that for you, regardless of the medium and the size of the class, you feel it's helpful to write them down. Alina is making an interesting point in chat that with online classes, she feels that there is perhaps a greater need for her to write them beforehand, whereas I suspect that means that perhaps, Alina, you're less used to doing it in face-to-face. And I think this is the point here, that Prabhu had this idea of, the teacher's sense of plausibility. And I think the point here is that, if something feels right for a teacher, their sense of interior plausibility, then it probably is right. So I don't think we want to be too military about this and say, you must do it this way or you must do it that way. I mean, certainly the first thing I say on any teacher training course is, please don't be me. Don't try and copy me, because you will be terrible at it, because you're not me. Evolve something that works for you. And therefore, there's no right or wrong here, as long as the journey to the ICQ is down to the individual. But for the students, the clarity of the ICQ and the initial instruction is all. And for me, I think it's the same for the CCQs as well. Maybe for a technical, so I'm teaching medical English at the moment. I'm not a doctor, I'm not clinically trained. So I've got a bit of medical vocabulary that I want to work with. I have a medical class this evening. Then I will write my CCQs in advance, because I want to make sure that I do know the difference between a peptic ulcer and a gastric ulcer. So I think it depends what you're teaching as well. We've got some great answers coming in chat here. Gabby's making the point of that if the instructions initially are clear, then the activity will be a success. Yes, no, absolutely. All I would say is that if you've got the student who didn't hear your clear instructions because their attention wandered, maybe there was a noise outside the window, or they were thinking about what they're having for dinner, the ICQs are that second chance to get what they're supposed to do if they missed it first time round. So Michael is making the point for essay writing classes that he does those, quick ICQs, how many paragraphs, how many minutes? No, definitely. Gabby, the best communicative activities will be a flop if students are not geared for the task properly. Absolutely. What a shame to waste a fantastic activity just because you didn't set it up clearly. We've all been there. Joe making the point about students to demo. Yes, definitely. And this is the point, I think, about ICQs and CCQs. They're not the gold standard. They are an option with others, particularly with checking meaning, timelines, realia, translation, synonyms, antonyms. They're all possible. You will know your students best, and therefore use the technique that meets their needs as appropriately as possible. Why do teacher trainers criticize ICQs and CCQs in Delta? Good question, Alina. I'm a Delta trainer. I'm not a Delta trainer, but I remember very clearly in my first Delta observed class being told off for not using enough ICQs. I think the point here is that I don't want to use good and bad, but let's put it this way. As a Delta trainer, you are looking for other things other than the CELTA. It's a different level qualification that focuses on more nuanced ways of teaching. And I think there is an assumption that the CELTA trained trainee, of course, will have their ICQs and CCQs more or less in place. That doesn't mean to say that they're not important. And I'd like to think that if I become a diploma level trainer, then, you know, I would still be talking about ICQs and CCQs. Do we have anyone in the room who is a Delta trainer or a DIP TESOL trainer or even a trainer at master's level? Because I'll be very interested to hear what she or he had to say. Gabby's making the point, if there is an absence of CCQs and ICQs in your Delta lessons, the lesson will fail. Yes, because you haven't managed the class properly. I think what happens is that sometimes teachers use meaningless questions. Yeah, reinforcing the need to review this early on in the diploma. This is often penalised on Delta courses. Maybe that's the point, Alina, that ICQs and CCQs are seen as, what's the word, things you really should have in place. And therefore, trainers get a bit kind of frustrated when they're not, because it maybe means that they're not able to get on to the diploma level qualities that they're trying to nurture for the course participants at that higher level. Thank you, Gabby, for that. Okay.
And just going back, sorry, Neil, to various ways of checking understanding. So I think it's very important to have a repertoire, a pool, or a collection of techniques or tools that we can use, because that may stop students from rolling their eyes. Yes. If we do things in various ways, like as Joe mentioned, demonstrating the task, asking students to demonstrate the task, or using realia, images, antonyms, synonyms, personalization. So all these kind of things can just add to the variety of the way of using ICQs or even CCQs.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting if you look both at the Harmer quotation from the presentation, also Trisha Hedge. They place ICQs in the case of Harmer and CCQs in the case of Hedge as one of a range of techniques that are available to you. And I think you're absolutely right that if you've got students who are beginning to find your use of ICQs particularly a little bit monotonous, then mix it up a bit. I find ICQs really helpful for online teaching because, you know, the realia, you may not have it easily to hand. Although I know, to be fair, a lot of people are saying with online realia is actually easier. But I think demos, student demos, if you've got students in different countries, getting them to demonstrate something A, B, when they're online in separate areas becomes a little bit more time consuming and difficult. So perhaps a teacher demo might be more acceptable online. I don't know, it'd be interesting to see what the rest of you think. Gabby's making the point about Hudella. Traditional CCQs are not designed for vocabulary and don't lead to extending students' understanding. How do I feel about this? I haven't heard Hugh make that point, Gabby. I know Hugh's work very well. Those of you who are not familiar with the name Hudella, he works very closely in collaboration with Andrew, whose surname is gone out of my mind for a moment, but they're lexical approach teachers. And they run some really interesting workshops around the world. They're very often in Russia. Andrew Wakely, yeah, that's it, thank you. I'd be interested to hear exactly what Hugh says in terms of quote unquote traditional CCQs, because I actually think CCQs are really powerful. If we use the example that was in the presentation, that it was the CCQ that helped students to move away from the word tired towards the word exhausted in that question. Is it more or less than tired? In the absence of knowing exactly what Hugh is saying, I would want to, what's the word, provide a bit of a robust counter argument in favour of CCQs. What I would say is that they're not going to be the best way for everything. So, for example, I'm going back to my own diploma here, and back in the late 90s, where you're kind of using contrastive techniques. If you take a whole load of very similar vocabulary and you drill down into the core points, you can actually map it. So if you take words like slim, thin, and so on, then you're getting into the point of not just denotation, the core meaning, but connotation, the positive and the negative attributes. And I think sometimes, having a little grid where you have 5 or 6 items which are distinguished very, very narrowly, by filling in that visual grid can be an alternative as well. So Gabby, thank you very much indeed for that. If you've got, Gabby, a link that you can put into chat of Hugh, perhaps in one of his videos on YouTube, or an article where he argues about this, Gabby does have that, so I'll not say any more. But Hedy, whilst Gabby's posting that in chat, is there anything else that you wanted to look at? I think we were talking about anchoring as a point to come back to. For you, what is anchoring?
Something that they use in NLP,
yeah, exactly.
Connecting emotional states.
Yes, but also I think the best example I ever came across for anchoring was Jane Willis, who's written with her husband Dave a lot about task-based learning. And Jane, albeit it always rather annoyed me, she had a little Tibetan bell that she would ring at the beginning of the class. And at the beginning, the first few weeks of her classes, she'd come into the room, the students have a few minutes of chit-chat, valuable practicing time, so she'd wait for them and then would ring the bell and say, okay, everyone, time to start now. After a couple of weeks, when she rang the bell but said nothing, the students had stopped talking. So anchoring is a way of creating a fixed behavior based on a stimulus. Or at least that's my take on it.
Yeah, it's like the Pavlovian experiment with the dog.
Yes, yeah, no, absolutely. So, Michael, can someone define anchoring? I'm not sure that was a definition, but hopefully it was an exemplification. So I think in terms of ICQs, which is where I think the question came from, if we kind of make it clear by our behavior that we're about to do an ICQ. Now, very often the teacher will stand back so she can see the whole class. And that movement from front of students close to them backwards becomes in itself an anchor that, oh, teacher's going to address the class now. And when does teacher address the class? In a presentation stage, but also when checking instructions and giving instructions. So I think there, the anchor doesn't need to be a bell. It can be where you stand. Gabby's mentioned here, the idea is to create a safe learning environment. Anchors in a lesson are almost like signposts. Yes. By having a routine which the students understand, they think, oh, I know what's happening now. It gives them a sense of reassurance. So Gabby, thank you for that additional insight into the role of anchoring.
It's like consistency, doing certain things the same or similar ways so the students know what's coming.
Yeah.
In a sense.
Exactly. It's all to do with habit formation in that respect. Hedy, is it all right if I come to Gabby for a moment? Because I know, Gabby, you had a really interesting point about TFU. And I think you had a really interesting question about this, which you wanted to ask, and how it might link to ICQs and CCQs. Nothing like putting someone on the spot here. Are you with us, Gabby? Are you able to put your microphone on? Ah, here she is.
Have I been given a voice now?
Yes, yeah, your microphone's on, Gabby. Hi there.
Yeah. I mean, look, hello everybody. Hi, Neil. Hi, Hedy. I mean, I do have a question, Neil. But it's, I feel like the question is so big, and you only have about 3 minutes.
Okay.
Me asking it would be absolutely ridiculous at this stage. So, perhaps we can leave it for your next session. Okay. So whatever topic you are going to cover next time, I will still ask the question. In the meantime, if I could just say something about Hugh Deller and this.
Fantastic.
So, yeah, I mean, I posted the link, and I really encourage everybody to watch this workshop. It's brilliant. It's really nice. It's just that, you know, I'm a fan of the lexical approach, but I am also very, very suspicious of the lexical approach. So I like it, and I don't like it at the same time. So obviously Hugh comes from this background. So it's kind of no wonder that he's questioning the use of CCQs for vocabulary, because the lexical approach comes with a different angle, right?
Yes.
But the idea that he was actually presenting in that workshop that I watched was that the traditional CCQs are limited for vocabulary, and in a sense I agree with it. And it's not to say that I encourage teachers not to use CCQs, because that's the most effective tool we have at the moment, okay, in the classroom. But perhaps it's good to actually reflect on it, because when it comes to vocabulary, like even if I take the example that you used, exhausted, right? Was it exhausted with that man?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you think about it, how can you really check, how can you show students the difference between exhausted and worn out if you use closed CCQs? You can't do it, can you? So because if you ask closed CCQs about exhausted, you may be checking worn out.
I think that's a really valid point. I think what's interesting with the way that Hugh and Andrew work, and this is both in terms of the seminars that they run, and they are superb, but also in terms of the books that they've published together, Outcomes as an example, they're very lexical, and they're very much, I think, about working, whether running seminars and live classes, with emergent language, and then giving students options in terms of the language they used. So if we go back to some of the answers that were given in chat, we saw drained, which I thought was a fantastic answer, because of course what happens to a battery? It drains. Worn out was given as well. And I think I don't want to make the mistake of saying that the lexical approach works best at higher levels. I think that's untrue. But I think those of you who are Italian speakers, this wonderful word sfumature, and I guess the nearest approach to it in English is subtleties of meaning, that these kind of subtle differences won't be fully covered by a CCQ. We need to go further. But I think that's probably, and I'm desperately trying to think of the term that is used for it. If you take drained, worn out, exhausted, knackered, one of the words that you put into chat, Gabby, is that, you know, they all have, in effect, the same denotation. So we need to work with connotation. Mm-hmm. We can work with connotation with the CCQ. So, for example, knackered, one of the questions I often use in CCQs is this a word you would use with your grandmother?
Yeah. So, and that was the point that Hugh was making. He was essentially saying that you can't really, when you use CCQs, kind of traditional CCQs, what you check is the meaning of the word, but the meaning is only part of what you should know about a word, because you also need to know how to use it. So you need to know, you know, the immediate collocations, etc., etc. So that was the point he was making. So obviously you wouldn't say knackered to your grandmother, right? Because the connotation is rather inappropriate.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, I don't know how helpful this point I'm bringing up, I'm making here is, but I just felt like maybe it was worth mentioning it, because obviously we have 70% of the teachers attending today are experienced teachers.
Yeah.
So I feel like, you know, this is just food for thought, right? So
in
yeah.
terms, for those more experienced teachers who have tuned in today, and thank you very much indeed for coming for a workshop that you might have initially thought, is how useful is this for me? If I can just throw out a couple of names, and I'll put it into chat whilst we're talking. Paul Nation, to give him his full initials, ISP Nation. You've got, who else? Jim Milton, who was chair of applied linguistics at Swansea University, where I used to work. Norbert Schmidt. These are all big names in that kind of, what's the word, the applied linguistics ends of vocabulary teaching. I also must mention one of the most inspirational teachers I've ever come across, Paul Meara. And all of these are writers who are undertaking active research, looking at the interface between second language acquisition and vocabulary, but with the application in the classroom. I mean, to give you an idea, Jim, who's now retired, is the chair of the panel of the Eltons. So he's at the kind of the cutting edge of books being published with innovation in it. Paul Nation is probably the one who is writing most actively about how to teach vocabulary in a more nuanced way. And, you know, I can't recommend Paul's work highly enough. Norbert Schmidt, and particularly his wife Diane, based at the University of Nottingham, have worked a lot together, co-authoring books looking at the academic word list. So I think in that respect, if you put any of those names into Google, increasingly you've got open access, and therefore access for teachers going on to diploma and to master's level. You know, these are some really important names. There are others, Laufer, based in Israel, big name in academic studies, in vocabulary. Martinez, who is one of Norbert's PhD students out of Nottingham, is looking at a lot at collocation, and rather than working at monolexical word lists, is really interested in multi-word word lists. So I think, you know, today inevitably was always going to be a blunt instrument in terms of helping with understanding. And yes, you can go so much further. But my point is this: if you are a scaffold, if you are, as a teacher, and I think I am, someone who helps students to build skyscrapers, what you need to start with is strong foundations. And my belief is that it's difficult to move on to these more nuanced subtleties of meaning if the students haven't grasped the core meaning, the denotation first. So go beyond CCQs, but don't necessarily reject them. Or to use that lovely idiom, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater.